When on April 9, 1764, Prime Minister George Grenville stood in Parliament and put forward the idea of a stamp duty being laid on the colonies, he remarked that a passage of a bill for that purpose would be delayed until the following year. Nominally, the delay was to give the colonies time to respond with their objections and to develop their own schemes for raising the necessary revenues in ways that were better suited to their circumstances. In May, Grenville met with the agents of the colonies in London to hold a conference on the stamp duty. The agents tried to get Grenville to say, in concrete terms, how much the colonies needed to pay. The Prime Minister avoided the question and countered with the proposal that the colonial assemblies assent to the idea of the parliamentary tax, even without knowing its terms. Obviously, this was not done, and the scene was repeated at another conference the following year, just before raising the issue again in Parliament. In reality, the gesture was nothing more than a rhetorical play. In the words of historian Edmund Morgan, what Grenville had given the colonies was not an opportunity to tax themselves, but an opportunity to refuse to tax themselves. On February 6, 1765, debates on the measure began in the Commons. The members of Parliament had been irritated by the loud complaints from the colonies regarding their right to tax them, and so were in no mood to debate the bill. From the perspective of its members, the Stamp Act was not merely an ordinary money bill, it was a symbol of its authority. On February 15, at the bill's second reading, petitions from Virginia, South Carolina, Connecticut, and Massachusetts were offered by their colonial agents. The petitions were refused. Parliament was not going to have its authority challenged. One of the few MPs in opposition was General Henry Conway, who pointed out that the whole reason for the year-long delay in passing the stamp duty was just so that the colonies might present these very kinds of petitions. Flawless though Conway's logic might be, the Commons passed the bill by a wide margin, and it received the King's assent on the 22nd of March. The news of the Stamp Act reached America in the first several weeks of April, and for a short while there was a surprising silence in the colonial press. That silence was soon to be turned into a thunderous roar. The bolt of lightning which pierced the calm was a newly minted member of the Virginia House of Burgesses for Louisa County, 29-year-old Patrick Henry. Henry was sworn into the House on May 20th, and only 9 days later, in the midst of a rump legislature, he introduced the 5 resolutions which would become known as the Virginia Resolves. The first of these resolutions said that the adventurers and settlers, their posterity, and all other of His Majesty's subjects who had inhabited Virginia enjoyed the privileges of the people of Great Britain. Second, that the royal charters of Virginia declared the same. Third, that taxation by elected representatives is the distinguishing characteristic of British freedom, and without which the ancient Constitution cannot subsist. Fourth, that Virginians had always enjoyed these rights and privileges, had never forfeited them, and that these rights had always been recognized by the kings and people of Britain. The fifth resolve was the boldest statement of all. It held that the General Assembly of Virginia was the only body with the exclusive right and power to lay taxes upon the inhabitants of this colony. In support of these resolutions, Patrick Henry's famous oratorical skills were on display. The diary of an anonymous French traveler who happened to be passing through is the only contemporaneous record of the proceedings. Henry is supposed to have said, "In former times Tarquin and Julius had their Brutus, Charles had his Cromwell, and he did not doubt but some good American would stand up in favor of his country." At this point, Henry's speech was cut short by the Speaker of the House, who accused him of uttering treasonous words. Henry then asserted his dying loyalty to George III, but by this time he had made his point. Of the 116 members comprising the House of Burgesses, only 39 were present when Patrick Henry introduced his resolutions. The votes were split nearly evenly, with the fifth resolution being the narrowest. It passed by a margin of only 20 to 19. According to the unnamed French observer, the debates over the last point were very strong. Some older, more conservative members of the House wanted the resolves expunged from the record. It's not clear why, though some historians have suggested it may have been less ideological and more generational, as Henry and his supporters were from a younger crowd. At any rate, the following day another vote was held, and the fifth of the resolutions was repealed, as it was, in the governor's words, the most offensive of them all. The Virginia House of Burgesses was unable to nip this last resolve in the bud, however. Copies of the resolves began to circulate throughout the colonies, and, in a clear case of 18th century fake news, additional resolutions were added onto the 4 actually passed by the House. The Maryland Gazette printed 7 resolves, the last of which deemed an enemy to this His Majesty's colony anyone who sought to tax the people other than the General Assembly of Virginia. As a result, the other colonies developed a false impression of just how fervent the Virginians were for their liberties. Not to be outdone, Rhode Island passed similar resolutions and even added one calling for resistance to the Stamp Act, a step so bold that none of the other colonies would do the same. On June 8, the Massachusetts House of Representatives sent a letter to the other colonies to meet together and unite their efforts in seeking relief from the stamp duty. Representatives from 9 of the 13 colonies would participate and meet the following October at New York in what would be called the Stamp Act Congress. Virginia, North Carolina, and Georgia were prevented from sending delegates by their governors, though the latter 2 are on record as respectively having rebuked their governor and approved the proceedings. For 2 weeks, the delegates debated what they considered to be the rights and privileges of the American colonists. In 13 articles, the Stamp Act Congress repeated what the colonists had already been saying, that they could not be taxed except by their representatives, that they had no representation in Parliament, and that their right to trial by jury was in danger by the extension of Admiralty Court authority over Stamp Act violations. And, as before, these rights were asserted from the perspectives of Englishmen defending their ancient English liberties. However, the very fact that the colonists had felt the need to unite together on a point of common interest meant that the political situation was now changing, and with it notions of American identity. Though the more conservative among them could not see it, more radical members like Christopher Gadsden of South Carolina said after the Congress, "There ought to be no New England men, no New Yorker, etc., known on the continent, but all of us Americans." So much for the legal arguments against Parliament's right to tax the colonies. The legislatures and presses of America spilled much ink opposing the stamp tax. But did any of the colonists take more direct action against the bill? Next time, we'll see the mostly peaceful protests aimed at the Stamp Act. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more, please comment, like, subscribe, and support me on Patreon. Thanks.